Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Methodicism. The text follows. In order to explain ourselves clearly as to the conception of the method and method of action, which play such an important part in war, we must be allowed to cast a hasty glance at the logical hierarchy through which, as true regularly constituted official functionaries, the world of action is governed. Law, in the widest sense, strictly applying to perception as well as action, has plainly something subjective and arbitrary in its literary meaning, and expresses just that on which we and those things eternal to us are dependent. As a subject of cognition, law is the relation of things and their effects to one another. As subject of the will, it is a motive of action and is then equivalent to command or prohibition. Principle is likewise such a law for action, except that it has not the formal definite meaning, but is only the spirit and sense of law in order to leave the judgment more freedom of application when the diversity of the real world cannot be laid hold of under the definite form of a law. As a judgment must of itself suggest the cases in which the principle is not applicable, the latter therefore becomes in that way a real aid or guiding star for the person acting. Principle is objective when it is the result of objective truth and consequently of equal value for all men. It is subjective and then generally called maxim if there are subjective relations in it, and if therefore has a certain value only for the person himself who makes it. Rule is the frequently taken in the sense of law, and the means the same as principle, for we say no rule without exceptions, but we do not say no law without exceptions, a sign that with rule we retain to ourselves more freedom of application. In another meaning, rule is the means used of discerning a recondite truth in a particular sign lying close at hand, in order to attach to this particular sign the law of action directed upon the world truth. Of this kind are all the rules of game of play, all abridged processes in mathematics, etc. Directions and instructions are determinations of action which have an influence upon a number of minor circumstances, too serious and unimportant for general laws. Lastly, method, mode of acting, is an always recurring proceeding selected out of several possible ones. And Methodicism, Methodismus, is that which is determined by methods instead of by general principles or particular prescriptions. By this, the cases which are placed under such methods must necessarily be supposed alike in their essential parts. As they cannot all be this, then the point is that at least as many as possible should be. In other words, that method should be calculated on the most probable cases. Methodicism is therefore not founded on determined particular premises, but on the average probability of cases one with another, and its ultimate tendency is to set up an average truth, the constant and uniform application of which soon acquires something of the nature of a mechanical appliance, which in the end does that which is right almost unwittingly. So in this chapter, von Clausewitz introduces the concept of method and of doctrine as a method, right? Methodicism intended in this regard as essentially a set of knowledge, right, that is applied in the theory of the art of war in order to, act in the first place. Today we study, as you see here, just the first part of the chapter that is quite long. I think we will do it in 3 videos, right? And in this first third, von Clausewitz essentially makes a bit of vocabulary here, if anything for understanding each other, but also making a big deal of clarity regarding to to the contents, to the concepts themselves that are very, very important. And the general understanding that you get even from just reading this is that fundamentally there can't be no absolute law in practice, right? There can be, but there can't be an absolute certainty, right? Even when we look at the concept of law, we see that things can go astray from that. But especially when it comes to the method, right, that is eventually taught to command, this has to rest fundamentally on an average of concepts, right? And that can naturally vary from reality, right? It's not always going the way you planned, as we've seen quite clearly, but it can't go in the first place, right? And it often doesn't, but still there is a way to identify a medium, right? A sort of balanced theory, the objective of which is to satisfy the more than 50% of the cases. Obviously, given that this is part of a system that in itself is quite complicated to frame. I mean, it's not there are not just two variables in here. There is definitely a complicated and infinite set of variables that, in this regard, cannot be put into a theory, right? But at the same time, there are certain general lines that you can guidelines, let's say, that you can follow to know that it is possible to at least have an idea what happens normally, and then how this changes every time you fundamentally look at the contingency. But the important here is to realize, and this can be explained here now, but we will see it in the future, how fundamentally this works most of the times. I mean, of all the things that happen into a war, into just even a battle, there is a set of basics that go on, right, that are very difficult to delineate in terms of boundaries and how they happen, for which reasons, but that are going to be present in a way or another, and that in this sense comfort the action of the commander, right? It's the way I say it, it's already too optimistic. Here from Clausewitz is making a sort of quite mathematics, saying, okay, you have to work with what you have, right? Even if the method sucks generally because it doesn't effectively represent reality, but at least you know that it's based on certain knowledge that effectively happens most of the times. Then the combination of all these sets of of knowledge, because they're potentially infinite, is wholly another matter, and that's why you can't have a textbook that tells you that what will happen in reality, but you can still have a manual that you can keep at your side and check in it when you're in difficulty to get maybe inspired in a certain sense, but you still have to do most of your work alone all the time. So von Clausewitz says, in order to explain ourselves clearly as to the conception of method and method of action, right, doctrine in this regard, which play such an important part in war, we must be allowed to cast a hasty glance at the logical hierarchy through which, as through regularly constituted official functionaries, the world of action is governed, right? So it's as if there were certain logical junctions that you need to take into consideration to realize that there is an order of things that, albeit quite blurred in detail, effectively exists in dynamic terms, right? So, because literally the world is governed by this, so it's not much that such dynamics are fictitious or conventional. It's properly that things happen with certain logics that are difficult for us to grasp, or at least they're difficult to see fully developed in reality, so that we can control it with our mind. But they're there, so we have to be aware of it in the first place and not to make relativism about it. Then he goes on and makes law, in the widest sense, strictly applying to perception as well as action, has plainly something subjective and arbitrary in its literal meaning, and expresses just that on which we and those things external to us are dependent. Right? As a subject of cognition, law is the relation of things and their effects to one another. As a subject of the will, it is a motive of action and is the equivalent to command or prohibition. So in other words, there are these connections, right, like commanding or prohibiting, like starting or inhibiting in some ways, and they're difficult to even explain because we give them somewhat for granted in some ways. We acknowledge that there is a part of subjectivity in them, right? We draw laws essentially in an arbitrary way, but still we know that we can essentially agree on that. There are certain causes effect relations that we can easily observe in many ways. So you see here how shaded the concept here is, right? You know, there is not an absolute truth here from Clausewitz is talking about. This is probably one of the most realistic and responsible ways to look at reality, right? We know that there are laws and we can agree on, but still we are open to the possibility that these laws are maybe wrong, right? Because every law is in some way subjective and arbitrary, not much because of the data that we collect through them, but because of the partiality of the means that we use to assess it in the first place. So it's very important that von Clausewitz starts from this already, unstable ground, because that's in a nutshell how we deal with reality and every time. And in here we can see how fundamentally these laws are reflected on the battlefield in terms that are as simple as command or prohibition, right? You know, if you have to pursue a fleeing enemy in the presence of other favorable conditions for which there is nothing that seems to obstacle that, but it seems maybe it's not, maybe it's an ambush, for example. It's fine to pursue the enemy. So this is maybe not a law in itself, but it's still one of those ratios cause effect that we give for granted to be the normality in a battle, pursuing the enemy when it's broken, when it's routing, right? So it's really that simple, and I suspect here von Clausewitz is really thinking of those, if you want, mechanical dynamics in war that are to be taken as, in fact, the basics of command in the first place. I mean, that logic that seems elementary, but that in applied reality can definitely hide, not in it, right? Because the principle is always valid, but in the other options that are out there, you still don't know, right? There are possibilities. As a matter of fact, dangerous, right? In this case that we exemplified, it's not even the law that is wrong, and that's why we in fact take it as still valid after all. It's simply another factor that can intervene to prevent us to fulfill that law. I think you like to see it in that way. So this is as simple as it can be, right? Then he goes on and says, principle is likewise such a law for action, except that it has not the formal, definite meaning, but it's only the spirit and sense of law, in order to leave the judgment more freedom of application when the diversity of the real world cannot be laid hold of under the definite form of law. As the judgment must of itself suggest the cases in which the principle is not applicable, the latter therefore becomes, in that way, a real aid or guiding star for the person acting. Maybe this is really the fitting term for what we were explaining before about pursuing routing enemies. Right here, it gets subtle because the law seems to me like just you have to keep on putting pressure on the enemy, right? And the principle, though, that follows is you have to pursue the enemy in that specific situation, right, for which you deem him to be retreating. Also, what is a retreat at that point? There are certain retreats that are, kind of orderly, that are in a situation in which they can even counter strike in case that that the enemy is being pursued. It happens, right? There are certain forms of defense that are still you can still put up during a retreat. Not just because normally there's always someone who remains back to hold the winner's pursuit, but also because you can, I don't know, think about after Yenefik with that Saxon battalion who was retreating in square formation, fenced off successfully the French cavalry, for example. So there are those cases in which, yes, this principle is there, you can see it very well, but at the same time it can bring you not to fulfill it every time, because it would be in fact too dangerous, while the law in this regard is more kind of an economic conception, right? It's almost physical, economical conception. I mean, the idea of why you should do that given the forces involved, right? What is more convenient to you or not. Then how you enact that is it's the step forward, is the idea that there is in fact a general principle that makes you make sense of a determinate action, as that there is still something different, however, from the absolute of law, because the way you enact it, right, can vary, evidently, and therefore can be subject to different forms of application, right? In fact, here, that's what Von Clausewitz says, that in order to leave the judgment more freedom of application, then posing even the situation in which the principle is not applicable, right? So here it's taken as the principle as a guiding star for the person acting, but not necessary, in fact, once again, something you must follow in every case. The law is more totalizing, right? But at the same time, you may not find the means at that point to enact, to apply it, even though that is the concept of the law in itself. I mean, for example, if you don't have enough forces to, because you're exhausted, to pursue an enemy, well, at that point, the law is telling you, well, that's why you can't, right? It's that simple, that relation cause-effect. The principle, operates in a measure which, well, in that specific example, you can't pursue, but as we've seen now, in the case how you can pursue, or if you can't pursue, just to stick to the previous example, which measures you should take given that moment that is usually very dangerous, right? When the enemy is fleeing, but you're also exhausted, the idea of a counterattack is, if the enemy regroups and reforms, it's concrete, and it's actually a very dangerous situation. There were battles, there were, clear victories that, the winners didn't understand to be so up to the day after, because maybe night fell and they didn't actually realize what was going on out there, right? So you realize here how multifaceted already the matter is, right? Not even a law is always responding sometimes to a reality, nor a principle is always applicable in the first place. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, principle is objective when it is the result of objective truth and consequently of equal value for all men, right? It is subjective and then generally called maxim if there are subjective relations in it, and if it therefore has a certain value only for the person himself who makes it. What does this mean? Because it sounds like flipping the coin, right? What is objective or subjective? What actually people agree on? What men agree on? Well, technically, yes, in the sense that a principle is something that objectively in the theory of the art of war can vary over time, right? Even in the way you pursue an enemy, right? There are different ways in which you can do it. There are certain variations that are practically imperceptible sometimes in doctrine that, however, happen historically speaking. I mean, there are moments in which historically something is more difficult to perform, in which there are theoretically more risks, in which there are certain means that can bog you down more easily. So at that point, it's not really a matter of the principle in itself, but how it's articulated by a community, right? That's also what the doctrine effectively becomes, right? If you give that as a guideline, you're essentially teaching someone that that's the case, that there is a certain objectivity in that in that teaching, but at the same time, this keeps varying, right? But these judgments, these changes can sometimes become extremely narrow, given not even generally a specific situation, but being extracted, especially as maxims, right? They are not, generally speaking, very useful most of the times in war, right? Maxims are, you can find the whole ancient world full of maxims, and incidentally, you will find that if there is a maxim that says something, it's quite likely that there is another one that says its exact opposite, right? So the maxim in itself is not just like saying, let's make a synthesis of doctrine based on the average amount of cases, right? So literally calculating from an objective point of view how likely it is something to happen or not to happen, or to be in a way or a certain way, right? It's not a matter of predicting what will happen on the field, it's rather assessing what are the forces now systemically that intervene in order for that dynamic to occur tendentially, statistically in a certain way rather than another. The maxim is something that doesn't make a lot of sense in this scientificity in war the way it is, right? There are certain proverbs, certain sayings that can be useful to highlight a specific matter, but that not necessarily are true. For example, it's plenty of quotes out there. If you search from Clausewitz from Clausewitz quotes on Google Images, one of the first that appears is actually a false one, a wrong one. That is, the best form of defense is attack, right? The best form of defense is attack is a wrong statement, right? Because we have to take this doctrinally speaking. Actually, the best form of defense is defense, right? Which means most of the times, defense has an edge for doing that over the adversary in those theoretical terms. There are situations that make you more advantaged or to attack rather than defending, but at that point it's not a form of defense, it's rather simply attacking the way it is. But the point is that phrase misquoted, because von Clausewitz didn't say that. If anything, he said in fact the best form of defense is defense, is what actually is a sort of wisdom that wants to highlight the fact that in certain conditions it's better to attack than to remain there without doing nothing. But it simply messes up the concept that of what attack is and what defense is that we will widely observe in von Clausewitz, right? That's an example of a maxim that in this sense is stupid in itself. It doesn't have a really practical value. If you consider it as, just take into consideration you can't always hide, that there are certain moments in which it's better to attack if you really want to do something about this situation than remaining there and leaving initiative to the enemy, right? But, for example, leaving the initiative to the enemy is detrimental, right? And this is a general principle, I would say, which is true, right? There are situations in which you can leave the initiative to the enemy, or maybe you're simply obliged to do because even you can gain a benefit or you can't do otherwise, right? But that's because of a relative situation. But in general, leaving the initiative to the enemy, idling, right, without essentially doing much in that sense, because that's what the phrase means, is detrimental, right? On average, which means that if you were to make an abstract comparison between what those forces that are evil forces are intervening in. The one who keeps acting when the other is idling has an advantage, right? How does this happen in reality? Well, it's always influenced by tons of factors from which the abstraction doesn't fit into the realm of the realistic assessment of all the things that are going on. But generally speaking, it is true, right? If you lack the enemy doing things that can be seen, by the way, as it's difficult in there, even in terms of thinking of what the initiative is. Sometimes the initiative is not even necessarily moving, right? But it's doing certain things that at that point can build a disadvantage for you and an advantage for the adversary. So even in here, everything has to be remodeled on the base of what we are talking about, and that's why the general principle is guiding you, but you should also be able to understand in which cases it's working, in which it's not, right? This is important because there are lots of collections of maxims that in this regard are more the product of a general set of ideas, of concepts, of proverbs. If you take Sun Tzu, for example, well, that's a set of maxims largely. I mean, people think that it's even part of a special Eastern military theory or culture. These people don't really understand what that thing is in the first place, right? And there are lots of people who are generally convinced of this, that a set of this principle it's a deep wisdom that who knows where it comes from. It's actually something extremely primitive and devoid of much of scientificity, and that's what von Clausewitz here explains quite brightly, I would say. But we will have to talk about Sun Tzu, because it's really disgusting how in 2020 we're still giving credit to certain interpretations of that work as if it was something special that had understood war, thousands of years ago, and that you just have to obey to it to obtain who knows what, right? And that modern countries, even in the Far East, do not absolutely follow Sun Tzu. They follow von Clausewitz, and I wouldn't even need to say this, but it just to make you see maybe a perspective on these things that is rarely put out there. At least in the general public, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, rule is frequently taken in the sense of law, and then means the same as principle, for we say no rule without exceptions, but we do not say no law without exceptions, a sign that with rule we retain to ourselves more freedom of application. So this is very simple to understand, right? Law is always is accepted as if there was no exception to it, which means, as we have seen before, that what effectively happens to that law is that another factor, maybe another law, comes to mitigate it in its practical application, but it's not that the law comes less here. It's always there and still valid. It's simply that there are lots of other factors that in which that law is there but is diluted, right, in the outcome of the general system. The rule is something different. The rule is, now we'll see in fact what von Clausewitz says, in another meaning, rule is the means used of discerning a recondite truth in a particular sign lying close at hand, in order to attach to this particular sign the law of action directed upon the whole truth, right? Of this kind are all the rules of games of play, all abridges, processes in mathematics, etc., right? So basically the rule is given for granted that there is a law that you can applicate in a certain moment given a certain set of situations. This is at least how I am understood in here. Like it's a sort of skipping mode that is given for granted that something is going to happen in that way. Now, this is somewhat a risky thinking, because naturally, as we've seen, everything varies, right? So you can't really bet on this rule to function and winning all the time, right? Sometimes it's also very risky to give for granted that you can get to this recondite truth simply through a set of conditions that will never come in the same form, in the same measure, right? In the same essence, right? And that are used to simplify yet a certain situation. Naturally, there are a set of rules that can be built in a doctrine, but always keeping in mind that it's part of they're part of a system in turn, right? So it's difficult in a given moment to establish if that rule is useful in the first place, because this is the main problem. It's not even in here much of saying, is that rule wrong or right, but really it's a sort of malleable set of combinations. You can't say, okay, yeah, we generally think that thing works, but only given certain specific conditions that are very rarely to be represented in a given moment, or maybe they're obscured by factors that, generally speaking, we didn't take into considerations. It's like when you take a manual, maybe not of instructions, but generally speaking, saying, okay, well, this tool is working in this way, right? The problem is that there can be situations in which you can't use the tool, and it's dangerous to pretend that insisting to use it is gonna make a difference at that point, right? This is how I see it, at least how I interpreted it. Then von Clausewitz says directions and instructions are determinations of action which have an influence upon a number of minor circumstances, too numerous and unimportant for general rules, right? So this is also very important because paradoxically, directions and instructions are sometimes, very meaningful in the economy of war altogether, right? They may be connected to trivial actions. They're not necessarily even particularly sophisticated. I mean, they're simple orders usually, right? But they are aimed at dealing with a situation that can be actually quite complex, and that therefore someone has to take care and action of. Like, directions and instructions in this regard are properly what people are told to do, let's put it in this way, to cope with a certain specific problem. Now, most of the times is left to the subordinates to decide how they have to deal practically with that thing. But the general direction fundamentally is given by by the instruction itself, right? By the order that is being given. And it's evident that in this case they're very contingental, right? We are descending. We've gone from law, principle, rule, and now direction, right? They're all things that descend much more into details. The idea here is that there is objectively a hierarchy, and it's very interesting because counterintuitively is actually the general principles that are kind of more essential, more and kind of easier to identify, right? If you look at strategy in itself, it's not much it obviously has to take into consideration an enormous amount of factors, but eventually what it translates itself into in terms of action is all quite simple, and all the hierarchy in this sense has digested those problems in part to make it become to a few essential information of which eventually strategists will have to cope, right? So all these other small things, the directions and instructions, are the rules, etc., the principles, are matter, if you want, of lower strata, not necessarily in the lower ranks proper, but they still have to do with things that, generally speaking, are by definition less frameable into a theory proper, right? And although it's much more difficult to take a strategic decision, at the same time that is guided by a limited range of options after all, right? That are more easily identifiable also in general. So there is more invention, in fact, at the lower level, and this is important because it's as if also the chances of things to go wrong increased in a way, right? There is a more probabilistic factor when you deal with the unframed, the uncontrolled, but not because that is less complicated necessarily, just that its scale is lower, right? So it's somewhat more trivial and less important, right? And that's why the law seems to belong more to politics, while the direction instruction more to war in itself. And there is this range of theoretical assumptions that will make up the doctrine. And in fact, von Clausewitz here talks lastly, it says, method, mode of acting, is an always recurring proceeding selected out of several possible ones. And Methodicism, Methodismus, is that which is determined by methods instead of by general principles or particular prescriptions. By these, the cases which are placed under such methods must necessarily be supposed alike in their essential parts. As they cannot all be this, then the point is that at least as many as possible should be. In other words, that method should be calculated on the most probable cases. So the doctrine here is a much greater structure, right? You have basically this method, this mode of action that you have built on the base of, in fact, of several possible ones that you have somewhat, not necessarily narrowed down, but rather built on the base of a set of notions that are accepted as functional by a certain political, read military community. So we'll see this a bit better when we talk about, in fact, other aspects of the theory of the art of war, how the doctrine is fundamentally built, and the importance of past experiences and command, but also military history, etc. But what this means is that it's obvious that doctrine is in itself a sort of it's a system that you basically must accept to be rigged in some form, right? And that's why doctrine also changes all the time, right? And there are, historically speaking, examples of doctrines that failed badly at one point. There was a misconception at the base. Think about World War II, right? World War I. At the beginning of the war, it took like 2 or 3 months to readapt the doctrine. From the pre-war to trench warfare, let's call it in this way, right? After 3 months for the beginning of the war, everybody knew how to fight it. So the myth that people got butchered in millions just because generals hadn't understood modern war is, kind of nonsense that we leave just to the unexperienced. But the point, though, there is that there had been a massive miscalculation of before the war of what this thing would have been, right? And it had also influenced at this point even the same strategic and political direction, right? They didn't expect it would go the way it did. So this makes you see how, in fact, there was a proper selection out of the several possible ones that was, in this sense, pretty narrow, right, as it is in general. But this doctrine is usually an object of studying, right, that derives, in fact, from what happens in war, properly meant. And it kind of constantly reshapes it on the base of debating, among the military community, not only, right, and it's a set of methods, in fact. It's not that there are necessary general principles in here, particular prescriptions in the means of employment as such, but you're fundamentally given for granted that reality will behave in a certain way. That's the interesting thing, and that's a very courageous, you know, it shows a great faith in fact, human application in this sense, and that's why, in fact, can lead to disastrous mistakes, because it's really about having this presumption that yes, war things can go in a very different way, but after all, we have somewhat put a boundary, a satisfactory boundary that shows us in the between, in the within, what the range of possibilities or eventualities can go, right? And naturally, these boundaries are constantly transpassed by reality, but doctrine is meant to at least take the majority of reality within its range, right? Within its boundaries. The most probable cases, that's the important thing, right? So it's a pattern that you apply to reality, and you think it's going to happen in that way. And what von Clausewitz says in here after is, Methodicism is therefore not founded on determined particular premises, but on the average probability of cases one with another. So once again, it's more a matter of observing what happens rather than thinking, ab origine, let's say, what that means. Which still happens because people study it evidently, but at the same time, this is a fresh formula, if you want. That in fact, it's how the military works largely, right? It's not that the military is effectively taught to know why the possibilities that doctrine encompasses come from and why they happen. They simply learn how to employ the doctrine, right? Because there is someone who has studied that for them largely. Then, of course, there are military scholars that deal with the creation of doctrine, look at general principles, etc. But largely, the military operates in this kind of, methodological, in fact, way, with certain modules, with certain patterns that, they are to be able to replicate, and they're trained for exactly for it, but they don't necessarily need a more enhanced, it may seem strange, but in fact strictly military education of the theory of the art of war as such. This is very important because you would be surprised, in fact, by how few about, for example, military history, military academies actually teach, and in which levels of accuracy and actual precision, right? And we don't have to be shocked about this, like it's normal, and the military is meant to function like this. It's not that, of course, it would be better to train better troops, but it not necessarily effectively what will happen on the field, as von Clausewitz himself has showed us, will pass through a better intellectual education. This is very, very important. Remember when von Clausewitz has stressed that, essentially the main military talents will emerge spontaneously from the field through action. Well, that's exactly what is meant. It's chiefly through practice, through experience, that eventually the good commander will emerge, right? Then the better if this commander has a military historical education, has a strategic culture that he can integrate complementarily in his knowledge, right? But it's not even the most important thing, right? So here everything is aimed at a strictly practical dimension. And in von Clausewitz says, and its ultimate tendency is to set up an average truth, right? The constant and uniform application of which soon acquires something of the nature of a mechanical appliance. Exactly this, which in the end does that which is right almost unwittingly. And here von Clausewitz stresses, right? It's as if there was a lack of wit, as a matter of fact. And it's not easy to get this, because we are used, in fact, to believe that the military talent requires chiefly, who knows which knowledge, right? And that you can understand everything. Just if you study so much history, you're a competent commander, you know everything because you have a strategical mind. Well, of course, if you study well, which is very difficult to do, military history, and believe me, for example, I've done it just a tiny bit, right? I mean, I've studied by this time a fair lot of history, which I need to do because that's what I do as a living. But studying military history at a very serious level, with all sources available, with your, as if you were to not to simulate, but let's say to get closer to what was the condition of knowledge of how the thing worked, right? It's very, very difficult, and it takes an enormous amount of resources, a dreadful amount of resources. It takes months, it can take even years, right? And you can just grasp a tiny bit of what that was in the first place. So, and that is the closest thing that arrives to military understanding out of direct military experience, right? Of command, of combat. So you can understand what the limits are to the intellectualistic approach to war, right? Too much speculation is dangerous. What you should be based on is actual evidence of military affairs, right? That can arrive through many ways, but they're usually much narrower ways than you can imagine. Just reading about stuff about war is not necessarily understand anything about war, right? It's very difficult, very, very difficult. But at a practical level, for actual command, for actual combat, what you need is this set of, in fact, quasi-mechanical knowledge that is delivered to you by through this method, right? That is taught, so it becomes method as a doctrine fundamentally, and that and we did arrive at the point in this regard in which war not necessarily is comprehended by the military. Maybe a military historian has a better understanding of war. On average, this is true. On average, a military historian has a better understanding of war than a military man. But a military man is a person who knows how to command in the first place, right? Knows how to make it work, and to make it work, hopefully, for attaining a good result. Whereas as a military historian, you can study war and understanding it, but not necessarily being capable of doing something on the field. That's the massive difference. And that's why understanding the military is crucial under this regard. Because I think that the future of the military is definitely to integrate fundamentally the theory of the art of war as mandatory education at a certain level. But it will never be it will never come first to actual experience gained on the field. That's the fundamental that Von Clausewitz does, right? We're definitely heading towards a better studying and a better understanding of war, right? The only fact that, for example, a person like me is bothering himself with pointing these things out on a place like YouTube is very meaningful of the age in which we are living, right? Because this couldn't, well, okay, the internet before didn't exist, not at Von Clausewitz times, but even a few decades ago, in this spread among the population. But let's say that there was also a way of looking at reality was much more primitive. Let's be honest about it, right? Even just think about what technology was a few decades ago, and you realize that it's not that technology is distorting the way that the war works, right? As many people that have to sell junk like those will, compare Von Clausewitz with Sun Tzu still do, like make you want to believe that everything now is changing in war and we're not understanding it. The essentials are always the same. What is changing is politics and society, and people are not educated enough to understand the change, and that's why they don't understand this specific war. But war in the essentials is the same exact one that has always been and will always be, And that's very comforting, telling the truth, because it makes you understand that rather than, um, you know, making out a war in order to understand war, we just need to study politics, society, our world, basically at 360 degrees. And there are challenges right now because the main challenges, I think, are political, right? We still approach these topics as if we need to be part of one group or another. We still attribute to, in fact, these military philosophies or cultures or traditions this, a founding value of how war is waged. This is not really like it. I mean, it's obvious that the politics in the society of origin has an impact. We've just said it on the way war is waged, but it's not because the essence of war is altered, so that you have to start, changing your moral parameters in order to understand it. This is the great difficulty, right? Of course, there are certain moral parameters that suck, that are bad, that they obstacle you to understand what war is, but not because that war is proper of one moral system or in another, but it's because it's a scientific evidence in the way it is, right? And that you can study, that you can get to know better. But the problem is also that in order to understand politics and society, you need a form of education that must be omnicomprehensive of a lot of stuff that normally here we don't have, because in schools we don't teach it. In universities, there are not curricula that allow you to get that, right? Objectively, a historian is a much better prepared military expert if he or she has studied military history specifically than, I don't know, a politologist can be if an expert of international relations and strategic studies. Don't think that this stuff is actually of there are all these schools of strategic management that are spreading, and you understand these people do not have any strategic culture whatsoever. They don't even know what they're talking about. It's just something that sounds good, that makes people thinking that you're somewhat an expert of what international relations are. If you meet anyone who mentioned the term geopolitics, just know that everything he or she says has no value whatsoever. Just know that, in military terms, they don't know what the hell they're talking about in the first place. And I'm really that radical because you don't understand the deep mistake that there is behind this, the deep misconceptions of considering, I don't know, that the war is fundamentally dictated by geography, which is definitely a way, not even a secondary, but a tertiary, but even far back in the rank of what effectively makes the difference in war. And until we will keep thinking in these terms, we will just make fool of ourselves. We'll basically surrender our intellectual instruments to what at the end of the day? There are not many other options, right? It's just irrationality, right? Moral relativism, dogmatism. Those are the only alternatives, right? And we will have to talk about this because we've never actually done it. Especially in these videos about von Clausewitz, I address these topics every once in a while, and they're my favorite part of the rant, right, of the ranting part, which you're probably not interested in. But I can tell you that that's something we have to start discussing at some point, because it's really even the need for this kind of education is really also a strategic asset. Don't think that, for example, the military is very interested, for example, in this kind of talk. They contact people that even you wouldn't suspect, right? They are involved in such things because they really care about consulting who has this comprehensive vision, because it's really a matter of education. It's not really, it's a matter of having built a system that is based not just on a specialistic competence, but in something more, extended. We're lacking that form of education. We are narrowing that down, right? Specialization in this sense is even a negative thing, right? The idea that you're expert just on that specific range of things, and you don't step out. We need something very different that means professionalism more than, but in a much wider range of disciplines. And there's also in general a lot of mistrust towards new information, towards the idea that there is behind, under the surface of entertainment, of popular culture, of mainstream information. And I say mainstream meaning an information in particular ways, not necessarily the media as such, but strictly from an informational point of view. I'm talking about really what are the accepted social standards of let's say of topics to be discussed in the first place. There are topics like this one, for example, that that surely meet with a lot of resistance and a lot of cultural even hysteria at some point. Like talking about war is you have to pay attention. Unfortunately, I say it, and I can't believe it at one point that in certain large environments, Western world, you have to to be somewhat apologetic for being interested in military affairs in the first place, as if that was automatically something. And that's the deep culturalist problem we're facing right now, because it seems we have built a culture that is largely founded on this premises that war is intrinsically negative and it's not an instrument of politics that is the true responsible of everything. But in that case, not even in the populistic side of the story, like and politics is a case. No, von Clausewitz is quite clear about this. That is, whatever the political, whatever politics does, society as a whole is responsible. There is no easy way out of this. It's not that dictator ordered me to do it, so I had to do it. And as a kind of excuse, I'm kind of a normal poor soldier. No, it doesn't happen like that. You're responsible fully for it, right? For your share. So it's and that's when you realize that our world is actually not at all at the standards of civilization that we expect, actually, of that level of civic and democratic culture we thought to have, right? We are still lacking the fundamentals of civic education, by far, right? And I say this because I have a huge respect and, I can't say pride in this regard of belonging to a certain part of the world, but at the same time, it's exactly for this reason that I think that this part of the world should be very, very, very careful about what we do, because we're potentially at this point, at least, those who are maybe not potentially, but who are de facto the ones who can treasure certain achievements of human civilizations that in other parts of the world are denied, right? And it doesn't just take to say, okay, well, let's celebrate human rights and everything is fine. It doesn't work like that. You have to make it work, and you must use your mind to do it, but not in an idealistic fashion. You have to understand truly what that means, or at a practical level. And it's hard. It's hard, because when you discover that law is just a convention, that we don't have any right technically in reality, well, you must. That's when you understand, though, the value of those rights in the first place. And most people are not used to this. I think that the newest generations are, simply prone to believe that it's normal to live like this, that we never fought to earn these rights, that society will work by itself. It's not like that. We have distracted ourselves massively. I think the internet, I love the internet, I think it's a great thing, but one of the worst things it's done is to distract us from actual concerns. The idea of creating this pleasant picture of reality through every medium, every social network, everything that makes you think that, yeah, after all, everything will go always fine, right? Because we're modern and cool, and no, it doesn't work like that. Sorry to say that, but that's exactly the problem. You have to revive this constantly, because it doesn't remain standing by itself. And the worst thing is that it's difficult to change the mindset of a lot of people that for decades and decades have have gone astray from certain visions, and that we're simply trying either to hide or to command or to, I don't know, it depends on the political side in which you are, but that still are making the damage. And it would be easy to, in fact, educate in this regard. That's why I make this Von Clausewitz series, because I believe it has this specific value. I mean, if you don't understand this work, I suspect there's no other way you can fully understand the relation between politics, society, and war. I mean, not fully in the sense that we can understand it for what reality, in reality, I mean, in applied reality it is, but at least in what in conceptual reality is, and therefore in which it works in actual reality, it's dramatically useful. And I have this sense that we're, I don't know, I'm not particularly optimistic in this regard. I think you can be realistic about the possibility that, of course, we will improve generally our, the instruments of control. We will understand what it takes to make this world more stable. But it doesn't seem the world is so stable after all, right? It's always on the verge of changing from in the wrong way, and it's always been like this, right? The problem today is that the consequences of a breakdown can be much worse and difficultly reversible than they were in the past. But anyway, we'll see, and just an admonishment. I don't know how to say it, but whatever. So I think we stop here, and we will go on with the second part of the chapter next time. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.